I'm sat here today with my colleague, Dr. Malcolm McLean, who's the reader in the Culture and History of Sport here at the University of Gloucestershire.
Hello.
Thanks, Malcolm. Now, in that context, in terms of being interested in the history of sport, one of the reasons I'm talking to you today is that we're about a quarter, maybe, of the way through the World Cup.
Yep.
And that brings people's attention very much to big sporting events. Now, I understand you've got interests that lie in relation to this.
Despite the fact that I'm not particularly interested in sport,
Odd job title.
but despite my job title, it is odd. Sport's really important. It's big business. It's culturally important to a whole bunch of people. It's really important to a whole bunch of men. And the way they organise their lives, their cultural reference points, in many cases how they organise their holidays. It's politically important. There's important things that happen about the way that nations shape and frame their identity. We've got, in fact, in a different context, I'm doing some work with some friends at the moment looking at nations that don't have states and how they use sport to assert national identities and
so an example of a nation that doesn't have a state would be
one of the cases that we're looking at is Sami in northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Western Russia, who are an indigenous population up there. So
they feel a sense of nationhood, but they have a formal legal state.
They have different forms of legal state in each of the three four states that they exist in. From in Norway having a parliament to in Russia not being recognised as even as a national minority. Or we're doing some work looking at the Circassian Games, which have been claimed by the Russians around Sochi as a way to, and around the Olympics there as a way to mark some distinctiveness. So the sport becomes important in a whole bunch of different ways, at an individual level, at a community level, at a nation and at a state level to do different kinds of identity, to say this is who we are.
That's kind of interesting, and I think you have particular interest in relation to kind of what you might call mega events.
Yeah. Well, mega events are really interesting things in sporting terms as well, because in a sense they encapsulate all of the stuff that's good and bad about commercial and consumer sport. We love it. We have a great time. Pubs are full of people watching games. Squares are full of people watching games on giant screens. Sometimes even, but not even in the country where the event is being played. Securing the rights to host mega events has become big business and incredibly important. If we look at, and we don't have to think back too far to look at some of the debates and claims that were made for the Olympics in London about how they were regenerating East London and saving it from its despair and decline. I spent a bit of time in East London. I have quite a lot of friends who live in East London, and they didn't quite recognise the East London that was either. Yeah. But also, if we look at the events in Brazil in the last 6 to 8 weeks as well, or longer, there's been a really interesting politics that's emerged around the World Cup there, where we've seen mass street protests about politics and economic redistribution, and the way that new venues have been built for World Cup events, the way that bits of cities, and we saw this in London as well, have been in effect closed off to the public. And London is a very good example of this, where there was an East London security island, and I use this near marks advisedly there, that was heavily controlled before and during those Olympics, where there was special legislation passed by Parliament that put controls on what could happen there and gave dispensation to the Olympics to be able to control and police that space.
So during a mega event, a public space like streets and things is temporarily depublicised and becomes a commercial private space.
Not only temporarily that parkland has become part of an Olympic venue, for instance, and is therefore privately owned and controlled. Land that's been used in all sorts of really interesting ways. If you walk between the aquatic stadium and the athletic stadium in the Olympic Park, you walk across what was a group of allotments. They're not there anymore, but these were places where people from the area grew their veggies. It was a social space for them. It was a vibrant, small community of people, and they put up quite a potent fight to resist losing their space. Eventually, they lost, of course, there's a pathway there. The allotments were moved to somewhere in Walthamstow. For some of the people who worked on those allotments, it was the 5th time they'd been relocated. And between a quarter and a third of them didn't take up. They just dropped out of the community that they'd been part of for many, many years. So we can do something like look at the claims for social and economic regeneration and that come from these kinds of mega events and say, well, arguably the evidence is out on that one, but at enormous cost to some people who live there. So
the discourse around mega events always contains a thread about benefit.
Yes.
So yes, there are things about it would be great for the nation status and all these things.
Yep.
Yes, we want to see, but there always seems to be a thread in that narrative about the benefits it would bring.
Yes.
And so how are those discussions kind of framed about what the good things that will come out? We want the World Cup because it'll be good for local people.
That's always framed as a legacy. What legacy does this claim? And for sports mega events, because there's other kinds of mega events as well. Not with quite the same profile as sports, but trade fairs and commercial ventures and those kinds of things. For sports mega events, it's always around building participation and the provision of new venues. Whether those venues are necessarily that useful to local people.
Well, there was a need in the first place.
Really good example of that is the island of Antigua in the West Indies. They hosted the Cricket World Cup there. I want to say it was 2007, but my grey hair means I'm a bit fuzzy about dates. Not that good for
at some point it happened.
Yeah, but it was around 2007 the Cricket World Cup happened. They built this fantastic new stadium just outside St John's, the capital city. They had a beautiful cricket ground in the middle of the city, really accessible to people, open space, heavily used. The new cricket stadium is one of those spangly new big enclosed stadia. Probably costs them more to maintain just to keep the air conditioning and the infrastructure running, which they have to keep going, otherwise it falls apart, than it costs them to keep the entire old cricket ground going in the middle of town. It's a long way out of town, it's not being used. It's crumbling and falling to pieces. Lots and lots of money, ridiculous amount of money spent building this for half a dozen one-day cricket matches. And so, coming back to Brazil, that's one of the concerns that people are raising there, that enormous amounts of public money is being spent to build sports stadia that in some cases aren't necessary because there are existing sports stadia. And by enormous amounts of public money, we're talking 11 or 12 billion US dollars.
That's a lot.
Quite a lot of money. To the extent that even icons of Brazilian football like Pelé are saying, this money could be better spent.
Yeah.
And when you get into that stage, you
So
probably got something wrong.
So even from a kind of utilitarian argument that says, well, yes, there are disbenefits like the poor allotment traded, the benefits outweigh the disbenefits. That argument seems, because it's always about legacy, one can only ever do the calculus about ethics after it's too late.
Well after the event.
And so that kind of objection to it is always that no, wait and see, we will fulfil our promises, but then there's no way of kind of pulling people on those promises.
Well, there's no way of holding them to those promises, and we've been listening to that claim now for 20 years around mega events where the legacy discourse has become very, very powerful, and there's no evidence that the claimed legacy, such as increased participation in sport, is correct. It just doesn't seem to happen, and there's very good evidence that it's wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you were cynical, which I'm sure you're not, but were you a cynic, you might be tempted to say
you know too well.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The government's wanted prestige and status, and they're willing to tell the story of legacy.
Yes.
While not really worrying too much about whether it happens or not, because it's already happened.
Yes.
It's too late.
I think that's very much the case, but governments are being caught out. The IOC is finding it very, very difficult to find a host for the 2022 Winter Olympics. Cities in both Oslo and cities in both Norway and Sweden held referenda that said that prevented their city governments from bidding for the Olympics.
The population didn't want it, though.
The population didn't want it. In Munich and in St. Moritz, Davos, bids had to be withdrawn after referenda, where the people of those cities said to their city governments, "Do not proceed with this bid and withdraw." That's a really important shift.
The juggernaut of international football's popularity, it's such that finding a host of the World Cup is kind of perhaps less at risk, but for the Winter Olympics, it's very interesting that such a high-profile event will be something people didn't want to come to then.
Well, in the case of Munich, where park the events around the Palestinian kidnapping of the Israeli team in 1972. Those games were spectacularly successful. Great sports venues, really well used until very recently. And indeed, the Olympic Park in Munich is still quite something to be proud of.
So the idea of legacy and public engagement and raising people's activity within sport isn't impossible. It could never, ever happen.
No, not great participation increases in Munich, but in terms of the space that came about. Yet here we find them 40 years later saying, no way, you're not going to bid for this. A place like St. Moritz Davos, which is wealthy and one of the glamour ski resorts of the world, saying we are not hosting. Yeah. We don't want to host this. They're really telling Munich, Switzerland, Sweden, and Norway, the heart of the sports and the Winter Olympics, saying no. There's an emerging discourse around the football World Cup as well, the men's football World Cup, where it's becoming, even in the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've seen more and more people saying the problems that are becoming manifest in Brazil are changing the game. And that's probably related also to the issues that have been emerging around the hosting of the Football World Cup in Qatar, where there's serious doubts raised about the integrity of the bid, and FIFA and the Qatari government are under enormous pressure because of the issues that are being raised around migrant workers' rights and building the stadia there, where there's phenomenally high death rates. Several hundred people a year die in the Qatari construction industry.
So we may or may not, but it sounds like we may be starting to see a kind of shift in terms of how much people are willing to kind of put up with those issues or tolerate them or feel that their enjoyment is somehow compromised by being aware of the fact that these things aren't without costs, and those costs aren't merely financial but quite substantial. People.
Yes, and we saw some of that starting with the Olympic Games and the Summer Olympics in London, where temporary stadia were built for a number of the sports, and the intention was that those stadia would be dismantled after the Games and relocated to Rio for the Summer Olympics there in 2016. Whether that's actually happened, I'm not sure, but that was the plan. At least that was the rhetoric. That was the claim. That was that they were the claims that were being made. So it's an interesting shift in terms of what we might think of as, say, power, in the sense that FIFA and the IOC and those kinds of big business international sports events are still remote. And don't pay terribly much attention to the rest of us, but they are coming under social, cultural, and political pressure to change. We've seen the emergence of groups such as Playfair, which is a group that campaigns around the ethics of the production of sports goods and memorabilia and so on and so forth, who have been able to use the Olympics in interesting ways, in really significant ways, to get major changes in the way we understand in the way we understand the production of those goods. So, for instance, just before the London Games, Playfair had commissioned a report that blew apart all the claims for ethical production of souvenirs, the little dolls and badges and those things. Playfair went to the London organisers and said, "We've got this report, we could release it, but actually we'd like to see how you're going to respond to it before we release it." And things happened like we found out the locations of factories that those goods were being produced in, which had never happened before. They always said there's commercial sensitivities here, and all of those things got whittled away. The day after that report came out in London, Playfair in Rio went to the Rio organising committee and said, "London's done this. What are you fellas going to do about it?" And it has shifted understanding. It's shifted the debates for us. There's still enormous problems. We've had communities of residents in Brazil, favelas that have been there for 60 or 70 years, that have been demolished to build car parks.
Right.
In one case, the car park just down the road from the Macarena Stadium, where the final is to be played, hasn't even been started yet, but 700 families were moved out. These aren't slums of the image that we think of as cardboard shacks and tarpaulins. These are houses that have been there for 60 years. These are communities. They may not be legal in terms of planning permission to build them, but that's what they are. We have no estimate of how many people have been relocated, but 250,000 is viable.
Really?
Yeah. Even the conservative agencies like Amnesty International are saying 100 to 120,000, and people closer to the ground have much higher figures.
Yeah.
So I guess coming back to that utilitarian claim, for the 50 people in the Waltham in the allotments in East London, or for the Clays Lane housing co-op, which was 50 or so households who were forcibly relocated to build the athletes' village there, in comparison to some of the claims that were made. You can say, well, okay, that's a relatively small cost. Really difficult for all of them. We were talking about 250,000 people. The population, we're in Cheltenham, the population of Cheltenham and Gloucester being forcibly relocated to build some car parks and a couple of football stadiums.
It's very hard to argue the benefits are going to outweigh that kind of issue. Yeah. But a whole bunch of interesting things there about how things like social media and kind of the weight of globalisation starts to chip away at those very remote, big, powerful organisations, in that they are still maintaining a certain amount of offhandedness to individual bits of public opinion, but that's starting to coalesce together to have these impacts on them.
Yeah, I get just popping up in my RSS feed. I don't know how many, 15 or 20 filmed news reports, all in Portuguese. I've got no idea what they're saying. Yes. From one media clearinghouse alone in Rio at the moment. There are half a dozen of those kinds of local World Cup specific versions of indie media.
Yeah.
And it's pretty easy for us to find out what's going on. It's pretty easy for us to raise concerns. And as we've seen, campaign groups like Play Fair develop as international campaign groups as well. Fairly easy to build pressure in multiple places in a way that was more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult for us to do 25 years ago, even 10 years ago.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks so much.